Welcome to Policing TV. I'm delighted to be joined by members of the National Executive Committee of the Police Superintendents Association, 4 members of that NEC, and with Chief Superintendent Harvi Khatkar as Vice President of the Police Superintendents Association. Very much there to please, on this occasion, Harvi, give us an introduction to the work of this particular committee.
So good morning, Bernard, and thank you for having me and my colleagues here today. As you say, we represent just under 1,500 members of all the 43 Home Office forces, as well as some non-Home Office forces and overseas British territories. So as an association, part of our National Executive Committee, we have representation from all of our regional forces, and my colleagues that are on today are our inclusion representatives, part of that same governing body. And what's really important today is that we talk about diversity and inclusion. And one of the key areas that the association focus on, and has been my focus for the last 18 months as the Vice President, is how do we work towards making the police service more of an inclusive culture? How do we listen to our members that have lived experiences in areas and understand the impact of that? And how do we improve the service, not just for our colleagues, but in terms of service that we provide for our communities? And that is really important. We know that policing needs to become more representative at every level. And as superintendents, we are that pipeline for a chief officer group. So it's really important that we have that visible representation, because having difference within teams enables us to operate better. We understand issues. And so today I've got my colleagues that represent areas of gender, race and inclusion, disability, and sadly my colleague Paul Court, who is our LGBTQ plus, is not able to join us, but I'll happily cover off some of those areas. So we've ran a number of listening circles with our members, and I'll let my colleagues talk about some of the work that has come out of that. So I'll start off with Sara Crane, who is our gender inclusion representative.
Thank you, Harvi. So yeah, I'm Sara Crane, and I'm based in Devon and Cornwall, but I'm the gender inclusion representative for the NEC. As Harvi mentioned, my role, as I see it, has been to gather the views of female superintendents and chief superintendents and identify any issues and barriers that they see within their roles, and take those forward to try and influence sort of policy and practice within policing, so feed it through Harvi or in at the national policing level. I could quite happily talk about a little bit further in detail about it, but I didn't know if you wanted to go around to introduce the others first.
Thanks, Sara. So I'll move on to Dave, who is our race inclusion representative.
Yeah, so my name's David Oram. So I'm a superintendent with British Transport Police. So I've had the honour to work with colleagues right across the United Kingdom. And one of the features, of course, but at all levels, as Harvi said, is the underrepresentation of society in policing. So I'm elected by the whole membership of the Superintendents Association to be an NEC member, but I also feel a responsibility to pay it forward and to represent underrepresented groups, and I think that's a real honour for me to be able to do that. And I suppose in the time while I hold this privileged role, what I want to do is it's probably 3 things: is look to our internal membership and to say to them, well done. You've reached the rank of superintendent. You're in the top 2% of leaders in the country. That's a massive achievement, and I think we have to put on our ball and put our foot on the ball and celebrate that and their achievements. Because for some colleagues, it is more difficult than others. I mean, let's face it. Let's operate in the real world. So I would say all those colleagues, well done. So I want them to embrace the role and the senior leadership position they're in as superintendents. So, that we represent superintendents and chief superintendents. If they want to go from super to chief super, that's great, and we'll support them, and we'll make sure that the level playing field is there. Likewise, if they do want to advance to chief officer level, currently the gateway is through the superintending ranks. It's right and proper that there is a fair process to get to chief superintendent and the chief officer. And it's fair to say the Superintendents Association has been instrumental in changing the qualification procedure to go to chief officer from what used to be called SPNEC through to now what's called the Police Executive Leadership Programme. And some colleagues who've gone before me have done a fantastic job doing that. But we can't rest on our laurels, and we have to make sure that the promise of a better process actually manifests itself in change and improved levels of representation. So I want to be able to do that. I also want to be able to say to my superintendent colleagues, you can also specialise in the rank. So superintendents are the senior leaders. So there's specialisms in policing. So, for instance, investigations, operations and public order. I want to say to all my colleagues that that's open to you as well. It's not just enough for you potentially just to get to the rank. Let's thrive in the rank and let's do things differently and better in the future. And I think some more of the challenges that I recognise is that we still have huge levels of underrepresentation. I described it at conference as a concrete ceiling. You can actually see it. It's not a glass ceiling. It's see it. And 30 years later, I don't think that I've been in the service. I don't think we've made anything like the progress we should have done. The pipeline in the federated ranks from constable to chief inspector is too short still. We need a better pipeline of talent to be able to come through. I think that's really important. But I was pleased when the Supers Association met with some aspiring chief officers with Gavin Stevens, the head of the MPCC, and Andy Marsh, the head of the College of Policing. And they were tremendously engaged, and we gave them a bit of a challenge to publish the data, both internally and externally, so people can get a real sense of where we are in terms of representation. Unfortunately, some of our members still have to live with a sense that the only reason they're in their roles is because of their background, and nothing could be further from the truth. And I think data speaks to that. If that was a truth to that, the data would tell us something else, and the data tells us the polar opposite. So I'm really pleased to be in the role. I think we're having conversations about how we engage stakeholders. We're having conversations about how we engage our own membership, and importantly, how we engage PCCs and chief officers who are currently in place to do more, to say more, to speak out more, and to keep the energy, because it is a difficult piece of work to get true levels of representation that sustain. What we do see from time to time is little glowing pockets of progress, but they do not seem to sustain. We've only ever had one black chief constable, Mike Fuller in Kent, I think a number of years ago. There of course have been some assistant commissioners in the Metropolitan Police and in some national policing positions, but still only one black chief constable. I think that says a lot, particularly at a time when we're trying to embed the police race action plan. I'll stop there because I've probably got a bit more than I should have done, but I think it gives a sense of the level of the challenge we've still to face. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Paul?
Yeah, good morning. Paul Burrows, not John Brown, as the moniker might say beneath me. I'm a superintendent in Nottinghamshire Police, and I'm the disability inclusion rep. It's probably feeding off a bit of what David said, that when we talk about do we know what our representation looks like, the thing with disability is that often it's not seen. Now, I'm dyslexic, I'm autistic, and I potentially have ADHD, and I'm going through the process of being assessed for that. None of those things can be seen. And so our staff team will largely be in a very similar position to the one I find myself in, that I didn't know who I was until I was about 55. And that was when my children were diagnosed themselves. And you think, well, I'm very similar to them. And then you go through this process of realising who you are. Now, how does that play out within the police service? The question that I find myself asking all the time is, do you know who your staff team is? There are figures going around within a number of organisations and support networks working within policing, within disability. And our belief is 30% of the police staff and police officer workforce have a neurodivergence, a neurodiversity, be it dyslexia, autism, Asperger's, or whatever. Many of those people won't know that, and many of those people won't actually be prepared to say who they are because of a fear of what the consequence may be. And we saw this at the Superintendents Association conference when we actually struggled, or Harvi struggled, to get people to go on video to talk about their experience, because there remains this concern of how people will be treated if they talk about their difference, be that ethnicity, gender, disability, sexuality. Now, that's something that clearly we need to challenge. And I see my role, and I'm relatively new in post, having been voted in this year, is to encourage organisations to ask that question. Do we actually know who our staff team is? And then give people the confidence to be able to actually be able to turn around and say, this is me. Because once we know, then reasonable adjustments and training can be put in place to feel and make people feel included.
So thank you very much all for those introductions, and just an acknowledgement also of Paul Court, who is unfortunately not able to be here today. Paul, we're missing you, but I look forward to our catching up again in the near future. Now, what I'd like to do now is just reflect on where we've come from before we then look forward to what can be done better in the future. And I'm going to start, Paul, with you, if I may. So reflection on where we've come from, on disability, which I'm going to say myself at this stage, I'm not sure that disability is quite the right term. I'm sat here in Abu Dhabi, where rather than a reference to those who are disabled, they refer to people of determination. So it's a different sort of mindset. It's that those who have these various conditions almost needs to be more determined in order to achieve the same results in society. Do you think, looking back on your and others' experiences with this wide range of inverted commas disabilities, do you look back and think, well, actually things have come quite some distance in where we were at to where we are today?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the language of disability, if I continue to use that word for the moment, is something that has morphed over the years. I was involved in sport for people with a disability 40 years ago, well before I joined the police. And certainly if I look at societal attitude towards those who have an impairment, a disability and neurodivergence, has changed significantly. The question you pose would be the subject of a very long answer, so I'll try and keep it short. I think the point where we need to get to is, if we look in the younger generation, those who are being assessed as having, or actually being sort of given a tag at school of being neurodivergent, is increasing significantly. I think society's understanding of disability, neurodivergence, is increasing significantly. What we need to do is accept that individuals who are disabled or neurodivergent have a big role to play in society. I mean, you talk about people of determination. You know, I understand the concept behind that language. I mean, one of the things that I've had used with me a lot when I've declared my autism is, oh, that's your superpower. And this is something I talk about, I talk about when I do training on neurodivergence. And I say, I don't know if it's a superpower. I think when people use that language, it's said with all good intent, but sometimes it doesn't feel like a superpower, because the reality is I live with perpetual tiredness. My dyslexia, my autism cause me to have to work probably that much harder than those people who don't have those conditions, if that's the right word. So at times it doesn't feel like a superpower. What I want is to be able to be myself at work, be accepted for my difference, because I do present differently to many other people, the way I interact with people socially and at work, and for people to understand that. And a very positive example was one of my colleagues who's sort of an assistant chief constable, who saw me twitching in a meeting because I struggled to sit down for any length of time. And he turned round to me and said, "Paul, just stand up if you want to." Now, that little thing of just saying, "Paul, stand up. If you want to engage in this meeting, stand up," made such a difference to me, because I wasn't paying attention that well, because I was bouncing in a meeting. And it's just little things like that. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It can be a little thing to actually say, "Do you know what? I actually know you're different. You can't sit still. Stand up and keep engaged." And that's, I think, the point that I want to try and get us to, where within the association and more broadly within the service, we understand that people react at work differently. They may want to behave, if that's the right word, in meetings differently. They will have different skills that might make them a much better firearms officer or public order commander. And that we need to say, yeah, actually, that this is a role for you. Now, the language, which is where your question started, is very important, but it's not the be-all and end-all. But enabling people to label themselves as they see, as they want to, is very important. There's a colleague of mine in my own force who will absolutely refuse to say that he is disabled. He has dyslexia. So if he's asked, "Are you disabled?" in a form on our HR system, he will say, "No, I'm not." And therefore the organisation, coming back to my key point of do you know who your team is, will not know that we have somebody there who's neurodivergent. So that language is very important. But I'm sure my colleagues would say it's using language that people are comfortable using about themselves, rather than language that is imposed upon them.
That's very helpful, Paul. Thank you very much indeed for that. I'm slightly conscious of times on this recording, and my hope is that we can run on a little longer than originally scheduled, and we'll take guidance on whether that is indeed possible or not. But Harvi, what I'd like to do is to come to you next. In Paul's absence, can I ask you to comment, looking back on the journey so far on the LGBTQ plus aspects. Has the police service in the UK made progress in this area?
So I would say it has made some progress, but like my colleagues have said on the call earlier, that it's still very slow, and there is still a lot more work to be done. I mean, one of the things that is so obvious is that, you know, for LGBTQ plus issues, you know, the service tends to get quite negative comments, and sometimes that's based on how the public may view certain events, and I think that is so unfair. I mean, I think you were at conference, weren't you, Bernard, when Paul talks about things like pride events and all of these. You know, the police have a role in terms of that community engagement. You know, part of the Public Sector Equality Duty Act places a duty on all public bodies, not just the police service, to engage with communities, understand their needs, and you know, we've had lots of criticism. Paul's role has been absolutely critical in not just only supporting colleagues internally, but those colleagues from other staff associations as well. And I guess similar to what Paul Burrows has just talked about is that, you know, sometimes it still is difficult for colleagues to be open about, their sexuality, and we shouldn't have to put labels on colleagues, but we should understand some of the challenges that they face and the barriers that prevent them from, whether that's lateral development, seeking lateral development, or whether that's promotion that they're seeking. And I think it's really worth perhaps you having that time to speak to Paul as well. I wouldn't want to do a disservice because, he speaks really eloquently about some of his own challenges and those of colleagues that he's helped and supported.
I'll certainly take up that opportunity in the near future. And I will also just acknowledge that at the most recent Police Superintendents Conference, the first session was related to these very issues. And it was a very powerful and moving contribution from a number of people, including those present on this call. David, I'm going to come to you next and then on to Sarah, to you in turn, to reflect on the journey that there's been so far, and then after that, we'll look at what happens next. So first, if I may, David, for you on race-related matters.
Yeah, so I do want to acknowledge at the outset, because I think it's important to be fair and balanced, that there has been progress. Let's be clear, there has been progress. My challenge to the service and others who support policing is that progress has been too slow. I remain an optimist, and I'm encouraged by the work of new initiatives such as the Race Action Plan, which was introduced in 2022. Now that action plan does speak very specifically to the Black community, but its principles within that plan hold true right across the spectrum of all backgrounds. They really do. For instance, zero tolerance for racism in policing, explaining disproportionality or reforming, increasing awareness right across the piece around inclusion, and developing a representative workforce. So although the Race Action Plan speaks to the Black community specifically, its principles are to be widely endorsed, I hope, by everybody in society. But what can we do differently and better? And I think, as I said earlier, we need to maintain momentum. When the Race Action Plan does come to a conclusion, we need to have an off-ramp, and we need to have a continuing journey of support. It can't be a cliff edge. We've got to continue, and we've got to look at the data and reflect on what the data tells us if we're going to improve legitimacy in policing. I mean, look, this is a difficult time for policing, but there have been difficult times for policing before. If we can continue to demonstrate our legitimacy to the whole community, internally as well, then that makes for a better society. So it's a win-win. It's a win for the service, it's a win for society, and it reduces crime ultimately. And I think that's what we have to be focused on. I don't think there's any quick wins, because we're trying to envelop a societal change in our internal society and our external society. But I want to challenge some of the unhelpful vernacular out there about this type of policing around legitimacy and representation is woke, because it's not woke. I don't even know what that means, and I think I've found that most people don't even know what it means. If it means being aware, right, and being aware of your rights and your responsibilities to others, then I think that's a good thing, and we shouldn't get hung up on unfortunate terminologies, I think, that distract people from the mission of who doesn't in society want to be treated fairly. Nobody wants to be treated differently or better than anybody else. Simply, I would say, in my role, is to be treated fairly and have a level playing field. And that's the journey that we're on. And I'm encouraged in that journey, but we've got to keep these conversations going, which is why I'm so keen to be able to speak today to you, Bernard. So get that message out there. What we're trying to do is inclusion reps. We're not trying to create a better world for a certain group. It's actually a fair and level playing field where everybody can participate. So hopefully I've given a sense there, Bernard, where we are and where we're going.
Helpful. Thank you for that, David. Sarah, over to you, please, looking at the gender aspects and the journey so far.
Yeah, thank you. And similarly, I would say there has been progress. I think gender issues have been raised for many, many years, and that awareness has made some changes. So, for example, in terms of what you would call male overrepresentation across the ranks, recent figures this year show that certainly at sort of the executive level, female representation is level, if not slightly above. But what I would say the worry is that sort of in the middle ranks, the sort of male overrepresentation is still there and female representation is actually going down. So we've talked about a pipeline on the call. You know, that is a worry going forward. And also sort of that energy has been mentioned. I think for us as representatives around inclusion in our specific themes, that's why it's so significant and important that we keep raising the issues moving forward. But for me, the sort of tangible things that changes that I want to make following linking in with members to understand the barriers and challenges are around that representation, and that's actually diversity across the board within particularly within specialist roles within policing. So that's a real area of underrepresentation for women. But there are some tangible things, and Dave mentioned about no quick wins. I think there are some in terms of gender. Yes, the broader sort of violence against women and girls is an ongoing piece of work. Again, that's a programme nationally linking in, that's both internally and obviously externally. But for me, I think flexible working is one of the biggest issues that the female members have raised as a barrier to that representation. So my tangible change is actually to keep raising that awareness. Definitely acknowledge that's come on. All forces have got policies and practices, but it's about scratching sort of the surface and making sure that they're being implemented and through all different ranks, so that it actually makes those roles accessible for all. And it might not just be females, it's all people who've got caring or other responsibilities that they need to manage at this moment in time. So it's about keeping up sort of that awareness and feeding into the sort of that national level through the NEC, through Harvi, to make sure that that's still acknowledged, because I get the feeling I've been in policing for 29 years now as a female, and things have improved, but in some ways things have also not improved. So I'll give a really tangible example, and that's around uniform is one of the things. Going back to specialist roles, we want more females within that particular role. However, forces still struggle to get the right equipment for them, the right uniform that fits. So it's really about raising those things at the appropriate level and saying, well, actually what we've got now isn't good enough. We need to be flexible. I suppose ultimately I would wish that flexible working is seen as a positive rather than a negative. And I think that sort of cultural sort of mindset, it's still seen as a negative and something that needs to be overcome. I think sort of from the top, if it's seen as a positive and devolve for people to make decisions around sort of operational things, which obviously, of course, have to be covered, but it's just looking at how that can be done a little differently, learning from other organisations and actually being, agile around filling sort of those duty rotas or filling different roles, perhaps with a job share rather than a one full person. So those things were present when I joined, and they're still present at superintending ranks. But it's just, highlighting those to sort of make that change. And I think if it went from a positive to a negative around flexibility, actually that would be inclusive for all, but that would improve that representation picture going forward. But having said that, because there is, that pipeline is actually going to reduce again in terms of females going through, particularly the ranks, that's why the work has to be highlighted, continually and once more to to make that picture improve.
Good to meet you all. Good to see you all. And we'll catch up again very soon. All the best.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Thank you.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Bernard.